One of the biggest controversies in vaccines over the last 20 years has been mercury. Unfortunately, a lot of vaccines used to have mercury. It was used as a preservative called thimerosal. And up until 2002, many of the vaccines had thimerosal. Now, it only had a little bit, but when you group a lot of vaccines together, each of which has a little bit of thimerosal, the amount of mercury that a baby's getting greatly exceeded the daily dose that was thought to be safe. And there's a lot of controversy over whether or not babies in the 90s and the early 2000s got an overload of mercury. Now, fortunately, in 2002, the government decided to take mercury out of all vaccines, except for the flu shots, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But now, you can get the entire vaccine series 100% mercury-free if your doctor's ordering the correct brands. But you hear a lot of rumors right now on the internet that vaccines still have a lot of mercury, or they're hiding it in there, or it's there but they're not telling us. The vaccine companies aren't disclosing what the ingredients are, but I really don't think that's true. I think that if you look at the product insert, the prescribing information that comes with vaccines, the ingredients are very clearly laid out, and I've studied them all very thoroughly, and I know that you can get the entire vaccine schedule 100% mercury-free as long as you take a few precautions. Now let me tell you where mercury is so that you can make sure your baby isn't getting any vaccines with mercury. There are only 2 vaccines that have the full dose of mercury like we used to give back in the 90s and the early 2000s. Those vaccines are some brands of the flu shot and some older formulations of the plain tetanus shots and the diphtheria tetanus shots that some people will get in an emergency room after they get a deep, dirty wound. Most pediatricians don't use the plain tetanus shots or the diphtheria tetanus shots anymore, so you probably won't find these older formulations in a pediatrician's office, but you might find it in an emergency room. So some brands of the flu shot and some older formulations in the large 10-dose bottles of the tetanus or the diphtheria tetanus vaccines. That's the only place you'll find the full doses of mercury. Now, there are a few vaccines that have what I call trace mercury, where the vaccine is manufactured with the full dose of mercury, but then the mercury is filtered out at the end, so it's only about 1% of the original amount of mercury that used to be in there. And that tiny, tiny little bit of mercury, I think, is very insignificant. Now, where will you find that trace amount of mercury? You'll find it in one brand of the DTaP shot, the shot we give babies for tetanus, diphtheria, and whooping cough. It's the Tripedia brand. As of now, that vaccine still has a tiny little trace of mercury. You'll find a little bit of mercury, a trace of mercury in some brands of the flu shots. And you'll also find a trace of mercury in the little individual dose bottles of the plain tetanus and the diphtheria tetanus vaccines that a pediatrician's office might have or an emergency room might carry. But those are only the little single dose bottles of tetanus and diphtheria vaccines that have the trace amount of mercury. The larger tetanus and diphtheria bottles that I talked about previously are the ones that have the full dose of mercury. There's an important distinction there. Right now, there are no plain tetanus vaccines that are 100% mercury-free. Anytime you're going to get tetanus vaccine, it's going to have at least a little tiny bit of a trace amount of mercury. Now, I've told you some brands of the flu shot have a full amount of mercury. Some brands have a trace amount. There are some flu shots that are made every year that are 100% mercury-free. And so it is possible to get the flu shot and the entire vaccine schedule 100% mercury-free as long as you know to stay away from any of the flu shots with mercury, the particular brand of DTaP shot that has the trace of mercury, and you stay away from any of the plain tetanus or diphtheria tetanus shots that have some mercury. As long as you know what you're doing there, or your doctor knows how to avoid those trace amounts, you can get the entire vaccine schedule 100% mercury-free.